Hi, can you hear me now? Great, that's wonderful. All right, good morning. Well, that was a bit of a rocky start, wasn't it? But I'm happy to continue. My name is Naeem, and I want to be talking to you this morning about research that I'm conducting here in the Hearing Systems section at DTU. That's part of my ongoing PhD project on assessing hearing device benefit using virtual sound environments. It's a project in which we are trying to look at how we can investigate human hearing and hearing loss, as well as the benefit of hearing devices in a more ecologically valid way, in a way that's more similar to how we all experience our auditory environment in our daily lives. And we do that using virtual sound environments. An environment like a spherical loudspeaker array that is capable of reproducing spatial acoustic sound fields at its center with great physical accuracy. And this way we can create a sort of auditory virtual reality for the person seated in the chair in the center and implement listening tasks for them. Now, to create such an auditory virtual reality, we first need to kind of define which scenes are critical in people's everyday lives, our critical sound scenarios, before we can reproduce them in the virtual sound environment, or VSE, and then implement listening tasks for normal hearing people, for hearing impaired people as well, and of course evaluate how hearing aids perform in such environments. And putting that all together, we hope to gain some understanding of how this environment, this VSE, compares in performance to existing setups, more artificial ones like headphone-based setups and artificial spatialized noise setups, as well as how it relates to the real world. So, to select our critical sound scenarios, we developed a categorization framework based on research done by Carolina Smits and others that categorizes real-world sound scenarios based on ecological momentary assessments carried out by hearing aid users. That means that every scenario they encounter in their daily lives they had to rate as either important, difficult, or common, or the opposite. And that meant that those scenarios ended up in one of these 7 regions of the Venn diagram. Now obviously we are most interested in scenarios at the center. Scenarios that are rated as important, difficult, as well as common in people's lives. And based on that selection criteria, we retained 2 scenarios that we found were in the sweet spot in the center here: a lunch in a public environment and an office meeting, which were both considered critical in that way. So that gives us a selection of sound scenarios. We also wanted or needed to obtain them, and we decided to actually go out into the real world and record these scenarios with a spherical microphone array. So here you see a photo of how that worked in the office meeting, where the listener position is encircled in red, and where we then subsequently put a microphone array, shown here in the public lunch scene, to record the background as well as capture impulse responses to really characterize this real-world environment. With those recordings, we could then reproduce the virtual sound environment. And to do that, we used the Audiovisual Immersion Lab here at DTU, which is a 64-channel spherical loudspeaker array in an anechoic chamber. We used ambisonic encoding and decoding of the 4th order to map the 32-channel microphone array input signal to the 64-channel output signal to be played back to the participant. And that's how we were able to construct these listening tasks. In a first experiment, we looked at how normal hearing and hearing impaired participants performed with regard to speech intelligibility, or SI. And we evaluated speech intelligibility for reference condition with headphones, using speech-shaped noise like you usually do in a speech intelligibility task, as well as our realistic VSE, the office meeting critical sound scenario in this case. We also had an intermediary condition using spatialized speech-shaped noise presented over 4 loudspeakers in the horizontal ring of the array. Our hypotheses were that this realistic virtual sound environment would decrease speech intelligibility compared to more artificial setups, and also that hearing impaired people would struggle more in such realistic environments compared to normal hearing people. And to implement this speech intelligibility assessment, we used a spatialized version of the Danish hearing in noise test, or HINT, with background level fixed at 73.5 dB SPL, since that was the level that we observed in the real office meeting scene. And we conducted this experiment for 10 normal hearing and 10 hearing impaired participants. These are the results that you get. In this figure, there are 3 panels, the red one, the blue one, and the green one, representing the 3 conditions: headphones, artificial spatialized noise, and the realistic VSE. On the x-axis you have hearing status, so normal hearing and hearing impaired, and on the y-axis speech reception thresholds, which represent speech intelligibility. The higher they are, the worse speech intelligibility becomes, and vice versa. Now if you look at the 2 box plots in red on the left hand side, you see this typical difference between normal hearing and hearing impaired participants' speech intelligibility performance that you would expect using headphones, and that actually carries over to the green box plots on the right hand side, which show an even increased difference between the performance of normal hearing and hearing impaired participants. So there's an overall shift, upward shift in SRT for all participants, so it becomes harder, but it becomes more harder, let's say, for hearing impaired people. And that's conclusion number 1. And then if you look at how the blue box plots in the center relate to the green ones on the right, there's another interesting observation, namely that results for the normal hearing people don't really seem to change compared to the hearing impaired, which gets significantly worse between these 2 conditions. And we think that that is because of the fact that normal hearing people can take advantage of the more modulated nature of the background noise in the realistic VSE to improve their performance, but the hearing impaired people can't, or can only do that to a lesser extent. And that improvement compensates for an overall increase in difficulty caused by the more intelligible nature of the background noise in the realistic VSE. So those are interesting observations. Going beyond that though, we also wanted to look at how hearing aids, when then used by hearing impaired people, could affect their speech intelligibility performance. And which was the second experiment, in which we evaluated speech intelligibility, again now for hearing impaired people, either unaided or helped by 2 different hearing aid strategies, which were implemented on a real-time hearing aid simulator that we built using the Open Master Hearing Aid framework developed at Oldenburg University. And there were 2 distinct strategies here, one that only included dynamic range compression, and a second that included beamforming on top of dynamic range compression as well. We evaluated these 3 strategies for 3 conditions, again, artificial spatialized noise, as well as 2 realistic VSEs, this time including the office meeting as well as the public lunch. Our hypotheses this time were that these 2 realistic VSEs, OM and PL, would again decrease speech intelligibility compared to the more artificial spatialized condition, as was the case before. But also that hearing aids would obviously or hopefully improve speech intelligibility in these conditions compared to unaided reference. And finally, that the hearing aid strategy, including beamforming, would improve speech intelligibility more than the one only including DRC. For this experiment, we again used the spatialized hearing and noise test, the Danish one, with background levels fixed now at 2 levels measured in the 2 real-world VSEs. And we had 10 hearing impaired participants with a similar hearing loss to the first experiment. The results for this experiment are plotted in a much similar way to the first experiment. Again, you have 3 panels representing now the 3 different strategies. Unaided, hearing aid strategy 1 and 2. On the x-axis you have the different noise conditions, artificial noise and the 2 different realistic VSEs, and on the y-axis you have speech perception thresholds. If you look at the box plots in red here, you see that the 2 results distributions corresponding to the realistic VSEs are significantly increased compared to the artificial reference here for the unaided situation, which is what we saw before in the first experiment. However, this also carries over to the other 2 strategies. So when aided by hearing aids, people still have elevated SRTs or poor speech intelligibility in the realistic VSEs compared to artificial conditions. In addition to that, the results are also quite spread out over participants, which is why we also looked at differences within one participant when moving between one strategy and another. So in the panels now you see the difference between unaided and hearing aid strategy 1, between unaided and hearing aid strategy 2, and then comparing the two strategies with the same conditions on the x-axis, but now showing the delta SRT on the y-axis, which indicates that if it's negative, performance improves, and if it's positive, it gets worse. Again, looking at the red box plots, you see that all hearing aid strategies, the hearing aid strategy 1 improves speech intelligibility in all noise conditions, but more so in the realistic VSE. The hearing aid has more benefit in the realistic rendering of the critical sound scenario. However, this is not really the case for the second hearing aid strategy, apparently. Beamforming combined with DRC in our VSE does not improve speech intelligibility to the same extent, maybe slightly here in the second real world VSE, but not in the other conditions. You also see that in the slight increase in SRT when moving between hearing aid strategies. So to sum up, my research tries to look at how we can investigate speech intelligibility for normal hearing and unaided and aided hearing impaired people inside various types of virtual sound environments. And we saw that realistic VSEs generally decrease speech intelligibility compared to more artificial conditions, regardless of which type of hearing aid processing is applied. They also differentiate speech intelligibility to a greater extent between normal hearing and hearing impaired participants. If you add hearing aids to the mix, this increases speech intelligibility, but more so in realistic VSEs. And finally, in our implementation of the beamforming strategy here, we did not see any significant benefit in our VSE. So to round up, overall I feel that this research shows the potential of these virtual sound environments to study impact of hearing aid signal processing on psychoacoustic outcome measures like speech intelligibility or speech communication in a more ecologically valid way, which I think these guys would love to hear.